Many of you will perhaps be familiar with one or both of Reg Bibby and Sam Reimer's work. I'll make a plug for both of you. If you haven't been to our bookstore yet, Sam recently published work with Mike Wilkinson on evangelical congregations in Canada. A national study of evangelical congregations and examines a range of beliefs and practices among leaders and congregants and so forth within there. An excellent book on the topic, highly recommended, that you can get in our bookstore, which is open till 4:30 today. Okay, so I'm giving you you have another break mid-afternoon. Would encourage you to pick that up if you're interested in that. And of course, Reg Bibby has long contributed to and led the conversation in sociology of religion, and many of you have read his work over the years and contributed invaluably to our understanding of religion and culture in Canada. As we were preparing for this day as a group, we thought it would be fantastic if we could invite these two scholars to engage some of the work, to get us to think. Perhaps they will push back on some of the ideas that we've presented, and that's okay. But as a way of from outside, so to speak, of those of us on the research team to help us think about some of the ideas that we've presented this morning. So have 4 questions that we've presented to them in advance, and they've seen our materials before, and asking them to engage in a conversation of sorts. They may engage one another, they may push back, engage on us, whatever, but really we just see this for the next half an hour or so as a conversation that will set up then a broader, larger conversation following that. So here's the first question that would love to hear from you guys on. What are you hearing from the data and discussion this morning? From the things that you've read and written about congregations yourselves over the years, what kinds of things stand out to you?
Hello? Oh yeah, we got volume here. This is great. This is interesting because I wanted to comment on just about everything that was said, but I thought I'd leave that to Reg. Yeah, to be honest, Reg, back in the mid-'80s, wrote his first book, Fragmented Gods. I remember reading that, and that really got me interested. So it's a real privilege to be with Reg on this panel. If he hadn't written everything he has about Christianity and about religion in Canada in general, there would be very little for us to disagree with. So he basically set the standard in those areas. Just let me make. Go ahead, Reg. Just a couple of things about what I've been hearing. The first one is there seems to be a real clarity among pastoral people in general that we're living in a less Christian, more secular context than we were before. No longer can we hang out the nice little sign on the church and expect people to come in. What is added to this is this idea that the society is becoming more and more antagonistic toward Christianity. I would say that is probably at least partly true. Going back to a lot of the work that Reg has done, he has demonstrated that there is a sizable minority who is still engaged in faith, and there's also a large benevolent middle that is not really against and not really for. I would say this group is ambivalent, and they are see faith as mostly irrelevant. And so the question is, how engageable is this group? And that's where Dr. Thiessen and Dr. Bibby have disagreed in the past, a little bit in this area. But I would say that this group is at least open to conversations about faith. And so we can definitely see some people here that we can engage. I noticed the media is not totally supportive of faith. You might have noticed that as well. You came here just to learn that today, didn't you? Like, that is mind-boggling. Not super supportive of faith, and I think that people like to hear stories that demonstrate that faith isn't all they crack themselves up to be, because it helps them understand better, give them justification of why they're not participating as much as they do. So I wonder if there's partly that. They're not closed off. They just see it as less relevant to their lives, and they don't mind hearing stories about failures by religious leaders. Let me make one other statement about this. This question about diversity. We'll talk a lot about that. It was interesting to see that come up in the Canadian context. Not super surprising because of the way the Canadian context is. But I would say that that is something that Canadians view themselves to be very distinctive from Americans in that area. And when I talk to American pastors and priests, they are big on diversity. They've been talking about this for decades. The Pentecostals are all over this theme of diversity, particularly racial diversity. They really want to see this happen, and they're very proactive about seeing it happen. But among the Catholics, among the mainline Protestants, very concerned about increasing diversity within their congregations. So those things didn't surprise me. In fact, in general, I'd like to note that my research on evangelicalism has demonstrated that, in spite of what we want, American evangelicals are a lot more like us than we probably are willing to want to admit. So,
well, likewise, a large number of things like to touch on, but limit things right at this point to a couple of starters. One of the things I really do like in terms of the naming of the institute is to talk about flourishing congregations. Many of you would be aware of the fact that a term that's been used a lot in the last decade or so, particularly the stuff that was coming out of one of the groups that's helping to sponsor things, namely Willow Creek, was the notion of prevailing churches. I hated that term. Prevailing churches are like hanging in there, you know, things are bad, but let's prevail. I like the idea of the flourishing church, to think in much more positive terms. That's one minor point. A couple of other very, very quick observations here. I find that when we're talking about certain aspects of ministry, so I'm jumping way down the list here, but in terms of neighborhood ministry, I'm rather puzzled by that, because my understanding in terms of congregations that are being sensitive to their neighborhoods and therefore trying to respond to their neighborhoods, my naive sense is, specifically in urban settings, very few churches that are flourishing are neighborhood churches. What they are, in fact, are big box regional churches, and there are people come from all over the city. And therefore, to be talking about neighborhood ministry, strikes me, a bit simplistic. I don't know that makes an awful lot of sense. I understand the concept. A bunch of things. The diversity idea. Our research over time has shown that virtually every religious group says that what they should be doing is responding to the diversity that's found in their cities, in their communities. Did a major study of the Toronto Anglican Diocese, for example, way back in the 1980s, where they said that one of the things that they increasingly were becoming was a diverse, Anglican church in Greater Toronto. Well, when we actually looked at the ethnic or cultural backgrounds of the people who described themselves as active Anglicans at that point, something like 95% of them were British. And the fact of the matter is they were not a very diverse church at all. I'm a bit, as part of me, and again, this is where it'll be fun to have a lot of time to throw around a lot of ideas. But diversity, spent a lot of time charting diversity in Canada, diversity along, a number of lines. And I'm suspicious that when evangelicals are talking about diversity, it reminds me of what evangelicals have been talking about when they talk about cooperation. Baptists, for example, my background. Baptists were seeing themselves as engaging in great ecumenicity, when a few years ago, for the first time, I was told in Canadian history, the 5 Baptist CEOs for the respective major Baptist groupings were meeting once a year near Christmas. To get those 5 Baptist presidents in one room was really quite an accomplishment. Well, I see the same thing here in terms of a parallel with diversity. If we're going to talk about evangelicals particularly, and flourishing churches more generally becoming diverse, I really am curious about the variables we're talking about. For example, there are rumors that women are still not full-fledged people within many evangelical denominations. Is that true? Still baking the pies and that sort of stuff? I'm not doing that kind of thing. But, so we can talk, for example, about, raise the question of gender. The extent to which, in light of immigration, that there's a real blending of Caucasians and other people, other visible minorities in religious groups, is a question. But then the real killer, the kind of thing the CBC reporter is going to flip at you. Namely, if we're being honest about it, within evangelical churches, to what extent does that extend? Are we still on? Somebody's purposely taking me out here. To what extent does that actually extend to sexual orientation? Our data suggests that there's very little of that. If we look at attitudes toward gays and lesbians on the part of people who are active evangelicals, it's not pretty. So, anyway, there's just some starter thoughts.
Well, thanks for coming today, everyone. It's good. What sociological theories, concepts, tools would you point to as useful ways for understanding this data and analyzing these initial findings and discussion points from your own reading?
I don't know why you're laughing. I wasn't being critical. I think, from my standpoint, and this will put my two colleagues here to sleep when I start on this at all, but I can be very, very succinct. And that's just simply to say, in the face of the predominant interpretation that has been offered as far as religion, what's happening to religion in Canada, namely secularization, I think focusing in on flourishing congregations is really healthy. Healthy in terms of the religious communities, but also for the Canadian public as a whole. It'll come as a bit of a shocker when you go on the eye opener, for example, in Calgary, and tell people that there really are flourishing congregations in Canada, and that they are found in virtually every major religious family. And I think it's a good reminder of the fact, again, thinking of theory and thinking of interpretations, of the fact that that secularization has been oversold. The fact of the matter is that we still have people globally who clearly value religion immensely, and the focusing on flourishing congregation, I think, is a further challenge, really, to the idea that secularization is pervasive, linear, and that it's just a matter of time until things are over.
Lots of things, again, I could think of here, but let me just give one that I'll try to get across. And the reason I'm emphasizing this one is because I wish I did it more in the book that is behind all of Reg's books over there in the foyer.
Hey, Sam, you need to get into stand-up comedy. You're wasting...
So this is one of those things like I do to my kids. I say, do as I say, not as I do, right? So I'm hoping these guys will take on this challenge. I think the real value that they can attribute here is for them to identify underlying mechanisms that drive the main traits that they're looking at for flourishing congregations. So what I mean by that is it's really important for them to begin by identifying the narratives that are used by people on the ground when they think about ministry and understanding how they understand the concept flourishing congregation. That's what they need to start. And then they need to go on and visit this notion of what are the traits of flourishing congregations. But if they can find out what the underlying mechanisms that allow for that trait to be activated within the congregation, then I think they're really making an impressive contribution. So what normally happens in this kind of sociological study is we say, isn't it interesting that there's a correlation between these ideas, these factors over here, like age or education or diversity, whatever kind, and flourishing congregations. That's an interesting point to make, but what allows, let's say, an educated laity to add to that, what explains education and, say, a possible correlation with outreach? What is that mechanism that allows that to happen? Here's an example. So if you read the sociological literature on flourishing congregations, they will say that the most important things, the strongest predictors, are those things that exist outside the congregation. Those contextual factors trump, the dominant... Yeah, okay, anyway, we'll move on. That dominate, that are stronger than the internal factors, okay? But if you talk to the church leaders, and I've talked to a lot of them, they say the most important factor is leadership. The stronger the leader, the better the congregation will do. Okay? But I say it's probably unnecessary and not sufficient. You probably need both, because there's a mechanism that is triggered by leadership that takes advantage of what is already existing in the context, which allows the church to flourish. So what are those factors that help us make that connection between leadership, strategic planning, mobilization, encouragement, whatever else that allows that to take advantage of contextual factors like disenchanted former affiliates or whatever is in the neighborhood that allows the church to flourish. Reg, you guys say something about that?
I don't want to say anything about that. I wanted to. I don't want to, get off track in terms of the direction with things, but one of the issues that you start with, of course, in the reports, is what, in fact, will be the criteria for determining what a flourishing congregation is. And it's interesting to me that although you politely go through and offer a bit of a pecking order with respect to the key characteristics, in my own work sociologically with congregations and with perceptions and so on, there's just nothing subtle at the end of the day. That the flourishing congregation, like it or not, is going to be one that has a numerical viability, that there's growth that's taking place. So the church down there, the parish down there, that's got 2,000 people showing up on a weekend or 700 on a Sunday night is regarded as flourishing. I've never forgotten an old Southern Baptist cliche line from yesteryear. They're saying that the mark of quality is not necessarily the absence of quantity. And I've lived over the years with the fact that when we report data, I have particularly, and I see it in the interviews, the mainliner is particularly downplaying the whole idea of numbers. Numbers aren't everything. And wanting to go to these other kinds of indicators. And I just think that from a practical point of view, organizationally, for a sociologist and an average person looking on, a flourishing congregation, at least one of the characteristics will be allowing for the fact there could be some geographical exceptions, but a flourishing congregation is going to be something that is measurable in a quantitative sense. There are going to be people there.
From your research on congregations to date, what should scholars and or church leaders have on their radar that either has been mentioned already or perhaps something that hasn't even come up at all, and you would say, this is something that absolutely ought to be acknowledged and part of this conversation?
My research suggests that evangelical congregations are no longer growing, and I suspect their trajectory is probably 30 or so years behind what we've seen in some of the more mainline Protestant denominations. And so we have to rethink about that area and what is going to allow congregations to continue to flourish within that stream. Cooperation is definitely widespread and I think is increasing. What's interesting in my view about the cooperation thing is there's different boundaries that are created. Mainline Protestants, again, are across the groups that, I wish we had that slide still up, Joel, across the groups that were mentioned there. So they will cooperate not only with secular organizations, they will cooperate with non-Christian groups as well. And they will cooperate within the Christian boundary as well. What I've noticed with evangelical congregations is they do 3 out of the 4. That is, they will cooperate with secular organizations. They'll cooperate with other Christian organizations within and without, in or with outside of the evangelical denomination. Thank you. Yes, that's the one. Evangelical denominations, but they tend not to cooperate with other non-Christian faiths. So there seems to be a bit of a boundary there, which is interesting, and I'm not sure exactly why that is, but I don't think there's a doubt that cooperation is increasing as people recognize they have more in common than they have disagreement about. I'm sure Reg is going to say more about this because he's really emphasized it lately, but immigration cannot be underemphasized when we look at the future, in my view. About 70% of our population growth in Canada now is accounted for by immigration, and it'll be 90% by 2050. If you can encourage your people in the pew to have a lot more kids, that is about one of the best church growth strategies out there. But that's going to be tricky, okay? So the reality is most of our growth is going to be due to immigration. So the ways in which your congregations, your denominations, your groups integrate and support the integration of immigrant peoples in our neighborhoods and in our communities is going to be increasingly important in the future. I'll stop there and let Reg have a shot.
Well, just to add a postscript to the immigration, I mean, in terms of trying to understand not only religious trends, but understand social trends in Canada, I'm working with you now on a manuscript where we're not only looking back 50 years, but looking ahead to the next 50 years. And the one variable that's been critical, will continue to be so critical, is immigration. I was interested in the work that our colleagues have done recently in Ontario, looking at the difference in terms of mainline congregations growing, where they tend to have something of a more conservative or an evangelical persuasion versus other mainline congregations that don't. And it's interesting in terms of understanding some variations. But if we're looking at the big national picture in Canada, there's just nothing subtle about it. Do you know that in the last 10 years, roughly, Catholics added 500,000 people through immigration? 500,000 in the last 10 years. And that's why the future is bright for Roman Catholics. When you hear these lines about the fact that the problem is finding enough places to actually put bums in pews, they're not exaggerating. Even in a place like Lethbridge, we see the dramatic impact even there of immigration, and the fact that the Catholic churches are invariably full. Despite all the other things that have been going on with the Catholic community there. But immigration just so critically important. The good news outside of Catholic ranks is that the other big player worldwide, as some of you may or may not know, really, if we can use kind of a collective grouping, we're really looking at Pentecostals. So it's Catholics, Pentecostals. And then in Canada, once more to understand the demographic picture, the other big player in terms of immigration, of course, will be Muslims. So we're saying, as we look at Canada's future, immigration is just so critical. So if we're serious about congregations having an impact and getting beyond rhetoric in terms of ministry to neighborhoods, what we're saying here is that congregations need to be poised, need to be trained, need to be whatever, to be able to respond to this dramatic influx of immigrants. It's not a new phenomenon, but as Sam has just alluded to, because of declining growth with respect to natural increases, we're saying we're going to be finding that Canada's growth in the future is going to be almost totally dependent on immigration. You think things have changed? Wow. As we look ahead to roughly, say, 2067, it's going to be phenomenal in terms of the impact of immigration. The bad news for if you're United Church and you're here today, not adding very many people. 10,000 in the last 10 years came here as immigrants who are identifying with the United Church of Canada. You wonder why the Catholics then are number one, 500,000 versus 10. No contest.
Let me just add one note to that point. My recent research suggests that, first of all, we understand that just less than half of the immigrants in the most recent decade are still Christian. So by far the growth is in areas of the non-Christian religious groups. Muslims, as Reg has already pointed out, lead that area. But within the Christian traditions, when we compare the number who are currently affiliating with that tradition, that is non-immigrant crowd, and the percentage who is immigrant coming in, that is the percentage of immigrants now who identify with that tradition, what we see is the order goes like this. It's evangelical, Catholic, and mainline. So what that means is that the evangelicals are gaining slightly. In other words, the percentage of immigrants coming is slightly higher than their percentage of the population, but it's almost a break even in that area. Catholics, it's slightly behind. Their percentage of the population now is slightly behind, and as Reg noted, but that's still the biggest group, right, within Christians. And the group that is doing least well as far as immigration goes is the mainline Protestants. So even within the joining, But we have to remember with the switching battle, the clear winner here is the nuns with the O, right? The group that is winning the most is the people who are switching out of a Christian faith, dominantly from the Christian faith, to become a religious nuns, not affiliating with any group anymore.
Final question for you guys. Oh, please. Well, hey, you're...
No, can I just a real postscript to what you're just saying. You can see so many things that come out of the report and out of some of the reflections. Sam was talking about the growth of religious nuns. Pew offers a cause for pause report regarding projections by 2050. So 2050 in terms of Canada. There's a sense among many people that the religious nuns are growing like crazy. They're around 25%. Heavens by then might be around 50%. Pew says about 26%. The growth is going to be relatively modest, largely because the people who are coming to Canada, while a significant percentage are definitely people who say they have no religion, most are adhering to some kind of a religion. So don't invest too heavily in the no religion market. It's not something that necessarily is going to be expanding dramatically.
Final question. What initial practical insights for church and denominational leaders come to mind for you based on some of the things that we've heard today?
Give them the good news and I'll give them the bad. No. Just kidding. Just kidding. No.
A few ideas. First of all, what was brought out by the research is that evangelicals particularly are often painted with U.S. brush. That is, they are largely viewed as the same as evangelicals south of the border. I suggest that with all the news about evangelicals in the recent election, that will become even more dominant. So what we find is that evangelicals, and I think Christians in Canada in general, are trying to distinguish themselves and say we're not exactly the same, but I think that task is going to be increasingly difficult. Most recent research is suggesting that the trajectory of the U.S. and Canada and England, Britain, are moving generally in the same direction, but just not necessarily all at the same pace and at the same time. So Canada, in between Britain and the U.S., I think is accurate picture. Interesting piece of work recently by a sociologist in England called Grace Davey, who came up with the belonging but not believing not belonging. Thank you. View. Her new argument is that religion in England has become what she calls vicarious religion, and what she means by that is that religion is not something that most people practice, but they expect religious leaders to vicariously offer religious goods to them so that they can have the Marion Barry thing done by them. And if that is where Canada is going, it'll be interesting when religious leaders refuse, for whatever grounds, to do the sort of rituals that they are expected to do. That's what they're there for, is kind of the view in England. That's what they're there for. You're there. How dare you refuse to marry? That's what you're there for, okay? And how dare you refuse to not bury, and they even want you to go up there and say things that they don't even believe, right? They want you to say things about the good afterlife and all these sort of things that they might not even agree with, but that is what religious people do, and that's their job. So our task in Canada, I wonder if it's going to be more and more about this vicarious religious offering the products, where it'll be more and more difficult for people, for whatever reason, to not offer a product will be viewed less and less favorably. I wonder if that is maybe where we might be going if England's direction is what we expect. Let me say one more thing, Reg, and then I'll give you the full shot, okay? I think the greatest concern you as religious leaders have for the future is what I'm going to call the move from an external locus of authority to an internal locus of authority. In your and maybe previous generations, in the pre-boomer generations, most people had or were much more likely to have an external locus of authority. That is, they looked to other institutions, to leaders, to whatever, to understand what was right and what was wrong. That has changed. I think the most important change in the last 50 years is we have moved internally. It is not like people have stopped being influenced by external forces. It is just that they now believe that it's up to them to decide what is right and what is wrong. And so when you tell them, "Thus saith the Lord," they don't even compute. They're not sure what you're talking about because they view that as one position, one view, that is part of a plethora of views that are out there that they pick up in the internet, and it's all part of the noise of positions that they hear around them. But the good news is that not all the voices that they hear are equally important. Some voices become more important simply because people have a relationship with people who are otherwise fairly relativistic about all these views and these positions. And when you begin to create a relationship with people, then all of a sudden your voice becomes louder and some of the other noise becomes quieter.
If I had time to tease, I'd say it's an important point, and it's a point that I've made in a book called The Boomer Factor that's buried in one of those books that's in front of Sam's. The move from deference to discernment that I think is really, really important, and I think what you're saying is very important. There were so many things that have come up, so let me just not playing devil's advocate. Hopefully, this is meant in the most positive terms. I'm someone who values faith, and I have to watch my clowning. I've told some of you before that my mother's wonderful corrected to me was to say, "You're not as funny as you think you are, you know," and I always have to keep that in mind. But one of the things
my wife tells me that too, Reg.
One of the things that it was interesting that the group was reporting on is the perception of leaders, and again, I think this is probably reflecting your data coming from evangelical leaders, that one of the important sources of growth, one of the important ingredients as far as a flourishing congregation is evangelism. And I have been preaching this sermon via data for years, but I would look and use a word my old Baptist pastor used to use and say, balderdash. The fact of the matter is, in the light of the kind of things that you're learning and the kind of research that many of us are doing, you want to have a growing church. And I say this as a former Baptist pastor myself. You want to have a growing church, evangelism is a bonus. If you want to have a growing church, we know by now what the major sources are. An evangelical church growing in Calgary, and we have a lot of data going back to the 1960s on this. A growing church here, this is an evangelical church, is growing primarily because it's doing a great job of recruiting geographically mobile evangelicals. That's the number one source of growth. So having things that will attract evangelicals who are on the move, we're saying is number one. Second, children of evangelicals. Third is a bonus. If all else fails, someone from outside the evangelical community. But that's not something that is a major ingredient if we're going to talk about sources of growth. And if we tie this into immigration, then, to me, this is just virtually a matter of connecting dots. That growing evangelical and growing mainline churches here, and certainly Catholic churches in the next few decades, will be churches that are not, they can be aspiring to evangelize, be working hard in terms of valuing evangelism. But if they want to be growing churches, if they want to be, well, to use again the term flourishing congregations, they're really going to be adept at being able to minister well to immigrants who are coming to Canada.
Yeah. Again, a small footnote to what Reg has said. It is quite true that somewhere around 10% of church growth is related to conversion. Both Reg and my research support that rough number. 2 or so per congregation per year are added based on external conversion. But let me add that an ethos of evangelism or an ethos that encourages conversion, it strikes me as important even if the numbers are not there, because I think there is something to say that if we are corporately doing this and we have a sense of mission and it gives us a sense of purpose, that's fairly important for ethos regardless of whether the numbers are doing that great or not. I would say that even one excited new convert can really energize a church, right? And so that strikes me as important that maintain that sort of ethos within a lot of our congregations, even if we don't have vast numbers as a result.
Reg and Sam, Thank you from our research team for giving your time and expertise. We have great respect for your work, great respect for the insights that you've shared with us, and I think helping us to think, importantly, about those contextual factors, those things external to what churches actually control that has a significant impact on this conversation about how and why churches and congregations flourish. So thank you for leading us so well. And again, final plug, once you dig through Reg's books, you can get to Sam's book in our bookstore, etc., and encourage you to utilize and leverage those resources. So join me in thanking Reg and Sam.